Okay, so we're going to do a quick redo video for the lesson 1.05. So please take the time now to pause and set up your page. You should have a stamp from class at the top of this page. If you don't, it's on the previous page, but everything should fit down at the bottom or on the rest of this page. We're on page 11, 1.05, and we are going to begin. And I will do this as a think aloud for you. With no thinking, well, the thinking question you don't have to write down. Okay, great. So we do. Determine the number and nature of the roots. Great. So I'm asked to determine the number and the nature of the roots. So I know number means how many. So I know I can have between 0 to 2 roots for any quadratic function, which is what I did in my do now. I saw that 2 roots touched twice. 1 root was only touching once, and it was the vertex, and 0 roots meant that it didn't touch at all. So I know I can have 0 to 2 real roots. Because I remember from my I do, or from my notes, that I can have 2 imaginary roots. But I want to know the number of real roots, and the nature of those roots is exactly that. Are they real or imaginary? And I know that roots obviously means when y equals 0. So when they touch the x-axis. So how can I use the structure of this equation in order to determine the number and nature of my roots? How can I use the structure of this equation in order to determine the number and nature of the roots? Well, I know from what I've already done, when I'm looking for roots, I'm going to use some type of factoring or the quadratic formula. And I know that the easiest thing for me to do first always is to find a GCF if possible, because I want to simplify this to make my numbers smaller. So I'm going to look for a GCF. So I see here between 4, 4, and 6, I have a GCF of 2. So I'm just going to factor out a 2 here to make these numbers a lot smaller for me to work with. Because now instead of 4 and 6, I have 2 and 3, which makes my life so much easier. And then from there, I'm going to find A, B, and C. Because I'm either going to factor or use the formula. Because I'm working with roots. And I see that I'm going to only look inside here for my A, B, and C values because this is equivalent. So I'm going to use 2, 2, and 3. Positive 2, and positive 3. Well, I only need to find the number and nature of my roots. I don't actually need to find the value of those roots. So when I look back to my notes from yesterday, I knew that I was going to have imaginary roots here when I saw that I had a negative under my radical. So I knew that if my number under my radical is negative, my roots will be imaginary. So I wonder if I only use that part of my formula. So what if I only use b squared minus 4ac? So I'm just going to use that part of my formula, b squared minus 4ac, because that's what's under the radical. And if it's positive, I know that I'm going to have real roots if my number is positive. If the number is negative, like I did in my notes, I saw that when it was negative 15 under the radical, I knew it was going to be imaginary roots. So I'm just going to use b squared minus 4ac, and I'm going to substitute my values into this. So I'm going to substitute a, b, and c into this little formula. So I'm going to do b squared, so 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 3. So I get 4. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8, times 3 is negative 24. And then 4 minus 24 is negative 20. So negative 20, what will that tell me? This is the number under the radical. So I know that if I was writing the quadratic formula, this would be the square root of negative 20. So what does that tell me about the number and nature of my roots? Well, because it's a negative under the radical, because it's a negative, I know that means that my roots are definitely going to be imaginary. So I'm going to have imaginary roots. When I think about the number of roots, because they're imaginary, I know that I have no or 0 real roots. Because I know this won't touch the x-axis. Because they're imaginary. Because this number here under the radical is negative. Which also means, though, that I have 2 imaginary roots. So I know that these two things are synonymous. I can have 2 imaginary roots or no real roots. They're the same thing. Great. So I know, and I'm going to just stamp this for myself, that if I use this b squared minus 4ac, and it's less than 0, so it's negative, I'm going to have 2 imaginary roots or no real roots. So what will that mean for if I want to have 2 roots or 1 root or real roots? So I know that if it's less than 0, it's negative. So what if it was greater than 0? B squared minus 4ac was greater than 0 or positive. What would that tell me about my roots? Well, if I had a positive under the radical, then I know they would be real. So I would have 2 real roots. But then what if I had 0 under my radical? So what if b squared minus 4ac was equal to 0? Well, that would mean I only had 1 real root. So I know that one of these 3 things can happen when I'm asked for the number and nature of my roots. And I know that this piece from under my radical, it's technically called the discriminant. And the discriminant tells me the number and nature of my roots. So now I'm done. I know that from this piece of information, from the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, because it was a negative number, I have 2 imaginary roots or no real roots.